There is a phrase in Isaiah 44 that appears exactly 4 times in the entire Old Testament, and 3 of those 4 come in a single chapter of Isaiah. It is not a throwaway line. It is not poetry that got repeated because it sounded good. It is a structural claim that defines the boundaries of who God is and who God is not. The Hebrew is asterisk ani rishon v'ani acheron asterisk. I am the first and I am the last. The context makes the intention unmistakable. God is speaking in the first person, distinguishing himself from every other thing that could be called a god, and he does it by asserting control over the endpoints of time. The first and the last means there is nothing before him and nothing after him, which means no other being occupies the middle either. The phrase is a fence. Now open the book of Revelation. In chapter 1, verse 17, a figure appears to John on Patmos, a figure whose description borrows heavily from the Old Testament theophanies. His hair is white like wool, his eyes are like flames of fire, his voice is like the sound of rushing waters. John falls down as though dead, and the figure speaks. And the first words out of his mouth are these, asterisk me fabu asterisk, do not be afraid. Then immediately, asterisk ego imi ho protos kai ho eschados asterisk, I am the first and the last. The exact same phrase, the exact same claim, but here it is not the voice of Yahweh from the Temple Mount. It is the voice of the risen Jesus. Most readers miss the weight of this. The phrase has been domesticated by years of liturgy and hymnody. We sing it without thinking about what it actually says. We hear it in sermons about Jesus being eternal and nod along. But any first-century Jew hearing those words from any mouth other than the mouth of God would have recoiled. The phrase was not available for borrowing. It was not a title you could share. The rabbis taught that the words I am the first and I am the last belonged exclusively to the Creator of Israel because they directly contradicted every claim of every Babylonian god, every Egyptian god, every local deity who had a beginning and would have an end. There was no room for a second being in that sentence. There was not even room for a close associate. The sentence was a wall, and Jesus of Nazareth walked straight through it. The force of this does not hit until you feel the structure of the Hebrew original. The word asterisk rishon asterisk does not simply mean first in a sequence. It carries the sense of origin, source, the one from whom everything else derives. An asterisk acheron asterisk does not simply mean last in line. It means final, ultimate, the one beyond whom there is nothing. Together they form a merism, a figure of speech that uses 2 extremes to encompass everything between them. When God says first and last, he is not giving a timeline. He is saying that every point on the timeline is contained within him. There is no space outside that claim, and Jesus takes it. The gospel writers knew what they were doing. Revelation is not the only place this happens. In John's Gospel, when Jesus says before Abraham was, I am, the Greek is asterisk ego imi asterisk, the same phrase used in the Septuagint for the divine name. The crowd picks up stones immediately. They understood the claim, but the phrase in Revelation is even more direct because it is not just a verb. It is the entire divine self-designation from Isaiah, quoted almost verbatim. John is not creating new theology. He is reporting what he heard and saw, and what he heard was a sentence that should have been impossible to apply to anyone except the God of the covenant. This raises a question that the text does not answer easily. If Jesus is using the words of Yahweh about himself, what exactly is happening theologically? Is he claiming to be the Father? That would be modalist, the idea that the Father and the Son are the same person wearing different masks, which the early church rejected as heresy. Is he claiming to be a separate God alongside the Father? That would be polytheism. The text does not let us off the hook with either option. It presses towards something the Old Testament never explicitly predicted, a distinction within the identity of the one God that does not break the oneness. The phrase first and last is a monotheistic fortress, and Jesus stands inside it. The average reader of the Bible today has been trained to separate the testaments. The Old Testament is the God of law and judgment. The New Testament is the God of grace and Jesus. Those categories are not just oversimplifications. They are theologically dangerous because they obscure exactly what the New Testament authors thought they were doing. They were not introducing a new God. They were insisting that the God of Isaiah had shown up in a specific human body, and that the body had used the same words the voice from heaven had used. If you do not feel the tension of that, you have not read Isaiah 44 closely enough. Here is the difficulty for anyone who sits in a pew or watches a video like this. We tend to treat divine titles as poetic descriptors that we can apply to Jesus loosely because we already know he is the Son of God. But the New Testament does not work that way. It does not add Jesus to a list of divine beings and then find him a suitable crown. It takes the most exclusive language the Old Testament has, language designed to shut every other door, and places Jesus directly in front of that language. The writers are not being careless. They are being precise. They believe that if Jesus is not the first and the last, then everything else they say about him collapses into idolatry. Because if Jesus is not God, then using God's words about him is blasphemy. There is no middle ground. Consider what this means for a person who reads the Bible devotionally. If Jesus is the first and the last, then he is not merely the one who shows up at the end of history to wrap things up. He is not a cameo appearance. He is the one who was there before anything else existed, which means he was there before your marriage existed, before your career existed, before your diagnosis existed, before your worst mistake existed. And he is the one who will still be there after all of it is gone. That changes how you read your own story. Every beginning and every ending is contained in him. The thing you think is the start of your life, that is not the start. The thing you fear might be the end, that is not the end. The first and the last is the framework around every smaller beginning and ending. But the text does not let you stop at comfort. It also demands a verdict. The passage in Isaiah 44 is not a general statement about eternity. It is a specific claim made in a context of confrontation. Isaiah 44 begins with God speaking to Israel and then immediately turns to a blistering satire of idolatry. People who cut down a tree, burn half of it to keep warm, carve the other half into a god, and then bow down to it. The claim, I am the first and the last, is the ground on which God prosecutes the case against every rival. There is no room for coexistence. If Jesus is the first and the last, then every other thing you have placed in that slot, your security, your reputation, your relationships, your control, is an idol. And the text does not offer a negotiation. So the phrase that sounds like a comfort is actually a confrontation. Jesus does not just promise to be with you at the beginning and the end. He claims that he is the beginning and the end, which means there is nothing outside his jurisdiction. And that raises a second question, one that the New Testament writers never fully answered in a single sentence because they were still working out the implications. If the first and the last is the exclusive designation of the God of Israel, and Jesus applies it to himself, then what has happened to the category of God itself? The Jewish monotheism of the Old Testament was not a simple mathematical oneness. It was a dynamic, relational oneness that left room for the Word, the wisdom, the Spirit. But nobody in the Old Testament ever said that the Word or the wisdom was the first and the last. That language was reserved, and now it is not. That is where the script cannot go yet, because the resolution is not in the claim itself. It is in what the rest of the New Testament does with the claim. And that is where the weight of this observation begins to press forward. The New Testament writers did not solve the problem with a single tidy formula. They solved it the way the Old Testament solved the problem of God's oneness, by letting the structure of the narrative do the work that a definition could not contain. The claim that Jesus is the first and the last appears 3 times in Revelation, not just once. It frames the entire book. In 1:17, the risen Christ says it. In 2:8, he says it to the church in Smyrna. And in 22:13, he says it as the final self-declaration before the invitation to come. The phrase is a bookend around the whole vision, which means the author wants the reader to understand that every judgment, every seal, every trumpet, every bowl, every throne room scene, every battle, every new creation, all of it is contained between 2 identical claims. The claim brackets the chaos. Now notice what John does not do. He does not have the Father say, I am the first and the last, and then have Jesus say something different. He has Jesus say the same words. And in the throne room scenes of Revelation 4 and 5, John describes the one seated on the throne receiving worship, and then he describes the Lamb who is worthy to open the scroll, and the language of worship converges. In 5:13, every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth says, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever." The object of worship is not divided, it is doubled. The grammar of worship refuses to separate them. The first century audience knew that worship was due to God alone. The earliest Christians were not being careless when they included Jesus in the doxology. They were making a theological statement about where Jesus belongs in the identity of God. There is a Greek word that appears in Revelation 22 and nowhere else in the New Testament with this specific force. It is *proskuneo*, the verb for worship, for prostration, for the physical act of falling down before a deity. In 22:8, John hears all these things and falls down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to him. The angel stops him immediately. "Do not do that. Worship God." Then in the very next verses, Jesus speaks, and he does not say, "Do not worship me." He says, "Behold, I am coming quickly." The contrast is deliberate. The angel rejects worship. Jesus does not. The implication is clear to anyone reading carefully. Jesus accepts what angels cannot. He belongs on the side of the worshipped, not the worshiper. This distinction is essential because the New Testament writers are not claiming that Jesus is a second God. They are not reducing the divine identity to a binary. What they are doing is expanding the reader's understanding of what the divine identity includes. The word *morph* in Philippians 2, form or nature, is pressed into service to say that Jesus was in the form of God and did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. The word *icon* in Colossians 1, image, is used to say that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Neither word means Jesus is a lesser copy. Both words mean that to see Jesus is to see the reality of God made visible. The exclusive language of Isaiah 44 is not diluted. It is relocated into the person of the Son. The average Christian today has been taught that Jesus is God, but they have not been taught what that claim actually does to the structure of their lives. If Jesus is the first and the last, then prayer to Jesus is not a secondary option. Worship of Jesus is not a permissible extension of monotheism. It is the recognition that the God of Isaiah showed up in a Galilean body, and that the boundaries of the divine identity now include this man. The earliest Christians were accused of atheism by the Romans because they refused to worship the emperor. They were accused of polytheism by the Jews because they worshiped Jesus alongside the Father. They were accused of everything from every side. And they held the tension because they had met the one who used the words of Yahweh about himself, and they could not unhear it. This is where the contemporary reader faces the weight of the passage. Most people who call themselves Christians have a functional division between God and Jesus. God is the distant authority, the one who makes rules and sits in judgment. Jesus is the accessible mediator, the one who understands and forgives. That division is not entirely wrong. The New Testament does present Jesus as the mediator, but the division becomes dangerous when it softens the claim of Isaiah 44. The Jesus who mediates is the same one who says, "I am the first and the last." He is not a friendly face on a distant God. He is the God whose face is friendly. If you separate the authority from the accessibility, you end up with either a harsh God you cannot approach or a domesticated Jesus you cannot obey. The text will not let you have either. Think about what happens when you face a moment of absolute finality, a deathbed, a courtroom, a diagnosis that carries an end date. In that moment, you do not need a Jesus who is simply a good teacher or a moral example. You need a Jesus who stands at the end of time and says that the end is not the end because he is the end. The first and the last does not mean he is present at both points but passively observing. It means he is the one who determines the meaning of both points. There is no outcome outside his jurisdiction. There is no final word that is not his word. The comfort of that is only as strong as the claim itself. If Jesus is just a man, the comfort collapses. If he is the first and the last, the comfort is solid enough to stand on. But the same claim that comforts also judges. The phrase appears in Isaiah 44 in a context of idolatry. The people are worshiping what they have made. They are bowing to wood and stone, and the first and the last declares that those deities have no existence. They are not first, they are not last, they are nothing. The application is uncomfortable because you have things in your life that function as first and last, things that shape your decisions, your anxieties, your hopes, your fears. A career can be first in the sense that it is the source of your identity, and last in the sense that you cannot imagine a future without it. A relationship can be first in the sense that it gives you meaning, and last in the sense that losing it feels like annihilation. A political cause can be first in the sense that it defines your moral vision, and last in the sense that its success or failure determines your hope. Every one of those is an idol, and the first and the last comes to displace them. This is the collision that most readers skip past. They read Isaiah 44 and think about ancient idolaters. They read Revelation and think about end-time spectacle. They do not connect the two, and they do not connect either to the quiet idols in their own chests. But the connection is the point of the whole biblical narrative. The God who says, "I am the first," and the last is the God who shows up in Jesus to dismantle everything that has taken that place in your life. The dismantling is not a punishment. It is a liberation. But it never feels like liberation at the moment the idol is being removed. It feels like loss. The text does not pretend otherwise. The resolution of the collision between Isaiah 44 and Revelation is not a logical formula that explains how Jesus can be the first and the last without ceasing to be the Son. The resolution is the worship that the book of Revelation describes. In the throne room, the elders fall down. The living creatures bow. The multitude cries out. They are not doing theology. They are doing what the weight of the claim demands. And that is the only resolution that the passage offers. Not a definition that satisfies the intellect, but a posture that satisfies the soul. The one who is first and last is also the Lamb who was slain. The one who holds the end points of time is the one who bore the nails. The claim and the sacrifice are the same person. That is what holds the categories together. So the final question is not whether you can explain the Trinity. The final question is whether you will fall down, because the claim is not a piece of information to add to your doctrinal file. It is a claim on your worship. Every time you read, "I am the first and the last," you are standing at the edge of that claim. And the passage does not simply inform you. It calls you to decide whether the one who says those words is the one to whom your life is oriented. Not your Sunday life, your actual life, the one with the career and the relationships and the fears and the hidden idols. The first and the last does not share jurisdiction. It is the claim that nothing else gets to be first anymore, and nothing else gets to have the last word. Not your failures, not your successes, not your losses, not your hopes. He is first, he is last, and everything in between belongs to him.